Yeah, so my name's Lily, and I'm currently a master's student at Kansas State University. I'm originally from South Central Nebraska, where I grew up on a row crop and cow-calf operation. And I actually did my undergrad or bachelor's at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and then I found myself here at Kansas State working on my master's in agronomy as well. But here I have a focus on weed science. So I'm trying to combine a little bit of my background with livestock and then this weed science aspect. So what I wanted to talk about today, I guess the title of my presentation is Grazed Winter Cover Crops, and are we really affecting their ability to suppress weeds? And this is kind of an important topic to talk about because cover crop acres are growing, not only in the United States, but here in Kansas as well. Kansas isn't growing on the number of acres as much as some of our neighboring states, such as Nebraska, Missouri, or Iowa, and obviously that's due to a number of different reasons, annual rainfall, or access to irrigation. But it still is important to talk about, and we want to make sure as extension folks and research folks that we are getting enough data and information to let you producers know if you are considering cover crops or already have cover crops, what some of those best management strategies are. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about the experiment, a little bit about the design of it to help you understand, and I won't get too far into that. But what we had is our treatment was basically grazing length, how long those cattle were grazing those cover crops. So we had our untreated check, or our non-treated check would be no grazing at all. So what we would do, we were doing these experiments on farm. We had a few different locations. One of those was around Topeka, one of those was around Hutchinson, and the other one was right at Manhattan, so Wamego area. You'll see that noted on the handout that I gave you. We did have a few other locations. Unfortunately, we didn't get enough data off of those to be able to sufficiently provide adequate research to you folks. Over in Ellsworth, there just wasn't any cover crop out there this year to be able to provide good enough data. And then we had a field up in Clay Center we were looking at as well, and there was cover crop, but there wasn't any weeds to be able to get enough data on this topic. So we did have a few other locations, but 3 worked out best to be able to present to you folks today. So we had our non-treated check, which had no grazing at all, and then we had about a few other treatments, which were like 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, basically whenever we got out to the field, whenever the weather was allowing us to be. So it's different with each location. So what we'd do is we would simulate the removal of grazing. And how we did that was we placed paneled exclosures out there so the cattle could no longer graze that area. So at 2 weeks we were going out there and doing that. So we simulated removal of grazing at those time periods. And while we were doing that, we were also taking samples of our cover crop that was out there and our weed biomass that was out there. So we basically evaluated our different treatments throughout the grazing season to kind of get that ratio of cover crop to weed biomass that was out there. And then we also had the opportunity to revisit our treatments late in the spring, right before planting or right before cover crop termination, which is probably the most important for producers to think about when they're most concerned about weed control, is when right when they're getting ready to plant, or obviously into the growing season. But as far as the cover crop goes, we were able to take samples then to determine before planting what the best treatment was, or how much grazing that was, or how much biomass was removed. Basically what was working the best then. So I'll go ahead and describe some of our results, so I'll have you follow along in our handout here. So we'll start on this first page, and I'll describe each of our locations, some of the dominant weed species that were there, as well as the cover crops that we had seeded there. So our first location will be Wamego, or right outside of Manhattan. And our predominant weeds at this location were some of our more aggressive summer annuals, like Palmer amaranth and foxtails, which a lot of producers are concerned about right now. So those were our dominant weed species, but we did not see any winter annuals at this location. I think I found one dandelion in one of my sampling treatments throughout the winter time. And our cover crop at this location was 45 pounds per acre of cereal rye, 25 pounds per acre of spring barley, 11 pounds per acre of radish, and 5 pounds per acre of spring pea. So grazing at this location started from the first week in December, and then it went all the way up until about the middle of April. So that resulted in about 92 consecutive days of grazing, non-consecutive days of grazing. So what I mean by that is obviously we get snowfall here in Kansas. So when the snow was too thick, the cattle were removed from that location. And in Wamego specifically, when your fence breaks, the cows get out, so they're grazing somewhere else. So they had to be removed while the fence was getting fixed for a few days. But in total, it was 92 non-consecutive days. And then we can take a look at some of the graphs that we have here. So our cover crop biomass is the graph on the left, and we see a lot of variability there. So these sample timings were taken before cover crop termination or before planting. So this cover crop had time to regrow. These different treatments had time to respond to the amount of grazing that they had, and I think that's why we see that variability, is each one of those treatments had a different response to cover crop removal, whatever the weather was at that point in time, and the different lengths that it had to regrow. However, when we take a look at that graph on the right, when we're taking a look at that weed biomass, we do see a significant difference when we're taking a look at our different treatments. So at 92 days of grazing, later in the season, up until mid-April, we did see a decline in weed suppression. But remember, this is only for our more aggressive summer annuals. But if you were to graze anywhere from 0 to about 34 days, or that 4 to 5 week mark, which was earlier in the season, more over the winter time, we did not see an impact on weed suppression at all, which is important to note, especially with those aggressive summer annuals that a lot of folks are concerned about. So next we'll kind of look at our other two locations, so over in Topeka and around Hutchinson. So I kind of grouped these two together because the predominant weed species at these locations were our winter annuals and a few perennials down in Hutchinson because it was a no-till system. So we're taking a look at these two kind of together. And some of our winter annual weed species that were here were our horseweed, our henbit, and our common chickweed, which aren't too much of an issue over the winter time, but they can kind of cause a disruptance when we're getting towards planting season. So when we take a look at these, we'll start with Topeka first. So at Topeka we had 85 pounds per acre of cereal rye, about 4.5 pounds of crimson clover, and about 1 pound of radish. And grazing here was a pretty lengthy period of time too, about the middle of December all the way to about the first week of April. However, at this location we can see that variability with our cover crop biomass, both locations actually. And when we take a look at our weed biomass, so that kind of middle graph, we see that there was no significant difference when it came to weed suppression, no matter how long they grazed or what their practices were with that. But we have to keep in mind this was only in reference to our winter annual species. And we kind of see, if we move down the graph to Hutchinson, at Hutchinson we had about 70 pounds per acre of triticale, 10 pounds per acre of winter pea, and about a half pound of turnip that was present. And we see that same thing. We see a variance in the numbers, but statistically we were not able to say that there was any effect on weed suppression when it came to our winter annual weed species there, which is pretty important to note. I would have liked to take a look at some of our summer annuals like we did in Wamego, but unfortunately cover crop termination and planting just came a little too soon to be able to take that data because those weeds weren't emerging at that point in time yet. So, but we did kind of get a pretty good look at both of those, our summer and winter annuals. So I guess if we kind of want to sum up what we've seen here, when we have moderate to heavy grazing later in the springtime, we will see a little bit of reduction in weed suppression with our summer annuals, but if we are more concerned about our winter annuals, we generally won't see that weed suppression reduction over that grazing period or later in the springtime. So I'll kind of switch gears and talk a little bit, if you want to switch to the next page here. So I just wanted to touch this, I know Ross will talk a little bit about this later, but I just wanted to touch a little bit on what we've seen and what some of the economics were behind grazing our winter cover crops. So I'll start off with the first table on the left-hand side here at the top. This is our alfalfa hay classification. So we have our supreme, premium, good, and fair alfalfa, and these values were provided from the Kansas Hay Market Report and how they rate their alfalfa values. And then if you take a look at the graph on the right, we have some of the forage values of the cover crops at our 3 locations, kind of averaged out between those 3 locations. But these were cereal, rye, and triticale dominated cover crops. So you can kind of take a look at what those forage values were over the grazing season, averaged across these 3 locations. And we can kind of make a little bit of a comparison based on our ADF, NDF, and crude protein values, that we could compare these forages to a fair or even slightly good alfalfa hay feed. So basically we're trying to take a look at, if you weren't grazing your cover crops, what else are you going to supplement your cattle with? And trying to compare those prices to put a value on what our cover crop is worth in the field as a forage. So we can take a look at that larger middle graph, and this is basically our hay prices over the 2021-2022 winter. And this was again from the Kansas Hay Market Report. So we have our alfalfa prices, which are about $140 to $150 per ton, and then we have our, I just chose a blue stem grass hay as an example. It can be any sort of prairie hay or whatever you folks are supplementing with or feeding. You can throw those numbers in there from the hay report for your own operation. But those were averaging anywhere from around $90 or so. So then I took these numbers and I kind of put them into a graph here to see what our cover crop would be worth at the 3 locations that we had this summer. So if we take a look at Topeka and Hutchinson, we averaged about, I don't know, a third the dry matter ton per acre. And then we can multiply that by our acres at each location. So Topeka had around 95 acres and Hutchinson had about 192 acres. And we get our total dry matter tons per field there. So averaging anywhere from around 35 to 60 tons per field across that whole field. And then we'll multiply that by the price of what hay was looking at that point in time. So anywhere from $140 to $150 per ton. We see some of those values there per field, and then some of our values per acre there. And obviously this is extremely variable based on whatever feed you're going to, whatever hay you're going to supplement. If you weren't grazing a cover crop, how much your cover crop's producing. But these are just some figures based on what we've seen over the winter time to just show you that there can be some value to that cover crop. So. And that's kind of about all I wanted to chat about today. Does anyone have questions? Please don't be shy and ask them.
Why do you think your field at Walmingo produced so much more?
That's a good question. I think they got it seeded a lot earlier. They cut that field for silage, so it was there a lot earlier. So when it was around that December time frame, the cattle weren't on it as long, and it had a lot more ability to grow that fall compared to the other locations. And I have those seeding dates somewhere, but I do not have them on me to let you know that. But I think that was the main difference.
You were saying for the Hutchinson and Topeka locations,
yep,
you were only looking at winter annuals because the summer annuals didn't have time.
Yep.
To germinate and whatnot.
Yep, so unfortunately by the time those producers were ready to plant, we just didn't get the chance to take a look at those. I wish we would have kept them out there, but it's hard to run a sprayer through the field when you have panels out there. So that's kind of the downfall of working on farm, is just not being able to have that control over the environment. So.
And you just didn't have the significance to show that there was a difference.
Okay. Nope. So we were based off of this, when it came to winter annuals, we didn't see much difference. And I think that comes a lot from the life cycles of those plants. Our winter annuals are growing at the same time as our winter annual cover crops. So they were coming up at the same time and competing basically the whole year, which is why I don't think we've seen those differences. When it came to the summer annuals, they have different life cycles. So in the springtime, when that palmer amaranth and foxtail were coming up, they were at the disadvantage because that cover crop was already well grown and able to compete a lot more with it. So.
Lily, do you know if any of these 3 producers at these sites were they looking to use their cover crop as a weed suppression tool, or was grazing pretty well their significant need for planting, or do you have any idea?
That's a good question. Over in Hutchinson, it was primarily for forage. They weren't looking so much for the weed suppression aspect of it, but when it came to Topeka, and I don't know about Topeka, but definitely around Wamego, they were definitely looking at the weed suppression aspect. There was a couple of brothers, and one of them primarily farms, and they actually planted green, so they didn't terminate their cover crop until later in the season. I think they actually got by without a pre in that scenario. So, but they are definitely looking at it, but it's kind of just a toss-up on what their priority is, I would say. So.
What was your planting method? Did you drill this stuff, or did you broadcast it, or how did you plant it?
Over in Topeka, I think that was interseeded, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think you flew that.
Yeah.
Some of that might have been flown on, I'm pretty sure.
Yep, I think that was flown on, and then the other two locations were drilled.
I just was curious. I know that the watershed has bought them rigs and they're doing some of that. I don't know what you're calling it, but
Interseeding?
well,
They're just doing an overseeding with a
overseeding.
Haggy High Boy sprayer.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's what they did over in, I can't believe if they flew it on in Clay Center, they flew it on, or they did that method of it, but they just didn't have much of a stand up there either, so just really dry this last winter and fall. So they got in a little later, I think, than they could have, so yes.
You plan on continuing this study for more years, or?
I'm not. Unfortunately, I'm going to be graduating this spring. I would like to see it continued more. We have all of the resources. We just need another student or somebody else to kind of take it over. So unfortunately, I won't be able to, but I would like to see more of it continued. So it's kind of hard to just say after one winter of data and these three locations to be certain on all that we're finding. So I do think that it needs replicated over a few more years, and hopefully we can find people to do that. So.
At the Wamego location, with 11 pounds of acre radish, how did that look out in the field?
What do you want to hear? What do you mean how
I
to
just
look?
never heard anybody seeding that many pounds
seems
of
like
radish.
a lot of radish.
Yeah, it was. And it was thick, but the cattle, I would say the cattle preferred the grass cover over that, but once we were getting further down to the winter time, they ate it just as much. So it was thick out there, but not too thick seeded
Did
with
it
the...
crowd out any of the grasses, you think?
I don't think so. That was a good question, though.